Okay, so welcome to my talk, When Chimps Are Smarter Than People. I'll start by sharing screen and showing you the title slide. And here it is. I'm doing this without an audience. Normally I use polls and try and make things interactive, but I can't do that, obviously, with this. So I'll just present things as quiz questions. And if you want to grab a pencil and paper maybe and note down your answers and see how you get on, feel free. So here we go. Let's start with a quiz. There are 3 questions at the start here. 3 multiple choice questions, and for each one you just need to remember an answer A, B or C. And here's the first question. So, how did deaths per year from natural disasters change in the last century? Do you think it more than doubled? Do you think it remained about the same, or do you think it decreased to less than half? So just make a little note of your answer there. I'll move on to the second one. And here it is. Women aged 30 in the world spent how many years in school? And for a bit of info there, men of the same age averaged 8 years. For the women, was it 7 years, 5 years, or 3 years? And here's the third question. So in the last 20 years, what's happened to the percentage of people in the world living in extreme poverty? And that's people who basically haven't got enough to eat. Has it almost doubled? Has it remained the same? Or has it almost halved? So if you've made a note of those, we'll move on. I'm not going to give you the answers to those myself. I'm going to introduce you to this guy. This is Rosling. He was the health advisor to the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and various aid agencies. He was Professor of International Health at a prestigious institute in Sweden. And he was the co-minder of something called the Gapminder Foundation, which I'll mention later, and also the co-author of a book called Thankfulness, and I'll be saying quite a bit about that. This is quite an influential guy. You can see here he's appeared in some top 100 lists. Foreign Policy magazine put him amongst their 100 leading global thinkers. A business magazine, Fast Company, called him one of the 100 most creative people in business. And Time magazine itself has a list of most influential thinkers, and he appeared in that. So this is quite an influential guy, and it's surprising how many people haven't heard of him. And I'm going to introduce you to him now, and he's going to give you the answer to those 3 questions. It's on a video on YouTube and also on the Gapminder website, gapminder.org. And the clip runs for about 5 minutes, so I'll introduce you to Hans. But before I do that, I need to stop the share and adjust the settings so you get a decent picture on it. Just change that now. And let's make our way to the video. And here it is.
I'm going to ask you 3 multiple choice questions. Use this device to answer. The first question is, how did the number of deaths per year from natural disaster, how does that change during the last century? Did it more than double? Did it remain about the same in the world as a whole, or did it decrease to less than a half? Please answer, A, B, or C. I see lots of answers. This is much faster than I do it at universities. They are so slow. They keep thinking. Oh, very, very good. And we go to the next question. So how long did women 30 years old in the world go to school? 7 years, 5 years, or 3 years? A, B, or C? Please answer. And we go to the next question. In the last 20 years, how did the percentage of people in the world who live in extreme poverty change? Extreme poverty, not having enough food for the day. Did it almost double? Did it remain more or less the same, or did it halve? A, B, or C? Now, answers. You see, death from natural disasters in the world. You can see it from this graph here, from 1900 to 2000. In 1900, there was about 500,000 people who died every year from natural disaster. Floods, earthquake, volcanic eruption, whatever, droughts. And then, how did that change? We asked, Gapminder asked the public in Sweden. This is how they answered. The Swedish public answered like this. 50% thought it had doubled, 38% said it's more or less the same, 12% said it had halved. This is the best data from the disaster researchers. And it goes up and down, and it goes to the Second World War, and after that it starts to fall, and it keeps falling, and it's down to much less than a half. The world has been much, much more capable as the decades go back to protect people from this, So only 12% of the Swedes know this. So I went to the zoo and I asked the chimps. Can you see? The chimps doesn't watch the evening news. So the chimps, they just choose by random. So the Swedes answer worse than random. Now, how did you do? That's you. You were beaten by the chimps. But it was close. You were 3 times better than the Swedes, but that's not enough. You shouldn't compare yourself to Swedes, You must have higher ambitions in the world. Let's look at the next answer here. Women in school. Here you can see men went 8 years. How long did women go to school? Well, we asked the Swedes like this. And that gives you a hint, doesn't it? The right answer is probably the one where fewest Swedes pick, isn't it? Let's see. Here we come. Yes. Women have almost catched up. This is the US public. And this is you. Here you come. Ooh. Well, congratulations, you're twice as good as the Swedes, but you don't with me. So how come? I think it's like this, that everyone is aware of that there are countries and there are areas where girls have great difficulties. They are stopped when they go to school, and it's disgusting. But in the majority of the world, where most people in the world live, most countries, girls today go to school as long as boys, more or less. That doesn't mean that gender equity is achieved, not at all. They still are confronted to terrible, terrible limitations. But schooling is there in the world today. Now, we miss the majority. When you answer according to the worst places, and there you are right, but you miss the majority. What about poverty? Well, it's very clear that poverty here was almost halved. And in US, when we asked the public, only 5% got it right. And you? You almost made it to the chimp. That little, just a few of you, There must
be. So that's Hans Rosling. So I'm going to go back to my share screen now, the other share screen, the one that's used for the PowerPoint display. I'm going to flip that across, go back to the slide we were looking at before we started the video. So we get things wrong, and the answers are actually better than most of us expect. And it doesn't stop there. This is Steven Pinker. He's an American psychologist. He's the author of a book called Enlightenment Now. And he gives a talk with the same subject. It runs for about an hour. There are 42 different slides of different statistics about the world. And in every case, there's some good news on the topic. There are all sorts of them. I went through and I looked at my own lifetime from the 50s onwards to see what the figures look like. And in my lifetime, life expectancy worldwide has increased. Child mortality has reduced. Childhood deaths from infectious disease is less. Famine is down. Extreme poverty, you've just heard, is down. Social spending worldwide has increased. International equality has decreased. And in the UK, Stephen used a US figure, but I looked up the UK road fatalities, and deaths on the road has dropped dramatically in that timescale. The environment, I did a separate slide for that because some of the people I give this talk to have particular interest in that area. And heaven knows there's enough bad news around. But actually, it's not necessarily all bad news. There are some lights in the tunnel, if you like. Deforestation, if you look at deforestation, temperate rainforest loss is now zero. We're not losing any rainforest overall. Temperate rainforest, tropical rainforest, we know is disappearing at an alarming rate. But that rate is actually down 2/3 since 1974. So it's still bad news and we're still losing it, but the rate at which we're losing it is much, much less. If you look at oil spills over the last 40 years, the amount of oil we ship by sea in the last 40 years has doubled. But the number of oil spills is down 85%. And if you look at protected areas, national parks and the like, over the last 25 years, the area covered worldwide by such spaces has almost doubled. And if you look at the sea, if you look at marine, it actually has doubled. So even in the environment where we hear all the doom and gloom on the news, there is actually some good things going on. So why do we jump to the wrong conclusion? Well, the human mind has evolved, and sometimes in our history, getting it wrong had its advantages. So if you're a caveman living out there and taking a look and you see something hiding in the grass and you think, is that a lion or not? You might take a run for it. And in fact, you're wrong. It's just a pussycat. It's not actually dangerous at all. So you make a snap decision, you run for it, you waste a bit of energy. That's what the statisticians call a false positive. You've come up with a positive answer, yes, it's a lion, and your answer is actually false. But maybe another guy takes a more careful look, sizes it up, and gets a true result. He gets a true negative. It's not a lion at all. But suppose it is a lion. The first guy is likely to jump to the same conclusion and leg it. So he's using his energy wisely now. He's got a true positive. It really is a lion. The other fella might take a little bit longer to decide. He'll come to the right answer, but he won't necessarily come to the right answer quickly enough. So sometimes a mind that gives the occasional wrong answer is an asset. Sometimes a mind that gave the right answer in the savannah gives the wrong answer in a modern society. And sometimes modern society poses problems that our minds just haven't evolved to deal with. And we have to find ways to manage that. And the psychologists have looked at the way our minds work, and they've come up with this term biases, cognitive or heuristic biases. And these are mental shortcuts that we take that give us some wrong answers. And there are hundreds of them. If you look them up on Wikipedia or something, there are just dozens and dozens. Some a little bit trivial perhaps, but some of them are really quite major. So these are systematic errors in thinking that affect the decisions and the judgments that people make. And they've given them all sorts of names. Selection bias, I'll explain that one in a minute to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Framing, loss aversion, the Dunning-Kruger effect, confirmation bias, anchoring, availability. There's just loads of these things. So if I take one just as an example to give you an idea of what we're talking about, selection bias. And selection bias is where we notice something more when we have some reason to be more aware of it. So I'll give you a couple of examples. This thing here is a Mark III Ford Escort. This was new back in the 80s, and I went out and bought one. And the day before I bought it, I would have said there weren't all that many on the road. Once I was driving around in it, they seemed to be everywhere. And about the same time, I was talking to my boss at work, and he told me he came from a place called Scunthorpe. And if you'd asked me, I would have said at the time, I probably never heard of that on the national news or on TV. I heard it mentioned 3 times in the next fortnight. So, who's affected by all these biases then? Who's coming to these wrong judgments? Well, you'd like to think that our judges, highly trained, very intelligent people, trying to be very logical and systematic and come to the right conclusion, you'd like to think that they're unaffected. But this chart here shows the proportion of favourable decisions at parole hearings. And from left to right, you're going from start of day to end of day, and you can see the proportion of favourable decisions vary wildly during the day. Why? Meal times, coffee breaks, had a huge influence on your chances of whether you get your parole or not. The time of day was a big issue. So these guys are perhaps not as rational as they try to be and would like to be. FBI and CIA intelligence agents, also a very, very competitive field, very difficult to get into. These people are the smartest of the smart. They're very, very highly trained, and yet they're affected by biases too. If you give them an exercise where information starts dribbling in about a chemical explosion, and the first bits of information they get suggest that it might be a terrorist attack, they'll tend to stick to that view, even if later information suggests it was just an accident. But if you give them the information suggesting an accident first, they'll tend to stick to that, even though the terrorist information comes in and they end up with the same information in both scenarios. So they're both affected by bias. And if they're both affected by bias, who else is? Well, I must be. I must be making wrong decisions. I must be making mistakes, taking mental shortcuts, coming up with wrong answers without even being aware of it. So how did we lose to the chimps? We've all been educated, we watch the news, we have vast amounts of data available to us these days at the touch of a button, and yet still we reach the wrong conclusion. So do we have to study all these biases, hundreds of them, and constantly allow for them? Is there a less academic, less tedious way of managing them? That brings me to Hans Rosling and Ola Rosling's book, Thankfulness. This is the inspiration for my talk, and the subtitle there is 10 Reasons We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. 10 ways we systematically, humanly, reach the wrong conclusions. And I'm going to give you 2 of those 10 cases today, 2 examples from the book. And the first one is gaps and generalizations, binary thinking. We have a tendency to divide things up into separate groups, into 2 separate groups, whether it be people or countries. So if you think of people, you might think of rich and poor, you might think of men and women. Countries likewise, you might think of rich and poor. I'd imagine there's a difference between the 2. But is there? If we take people, first of all, rich and poor people, and we look at Brazil, which is one of the more unequal countries in the world, the richest 10% have 41% of the wealth, which sounds dreadful. And you'll see news coverage of big, with photos of big yachts and condominiums and all that kind of stuff, and pictures of poor people who are living in shacks and starving. But if you look at the population as a whole, and this thing shows the poorest people on the left, and the richest people on the right, you can see that the majority of people are actually somewhere in the middle. There's not a gap between rich and poor. And even when you talk about people who are poor, poor people all alike, from our position in a reasonably wealthy country, hopefully with a decent income, we tend to look down and imagine poor people as all the same. And if you look in one of our cupboards, you might find a bunch of electric toothbrushes in our bathroom cabinet. If you go to a slightly poorer country or slightly poorer people, you might find that they're using ordinary toothbrushes, not the electric ones, but you can still go down the scale. Poorer families still might be using a single toothbrush for the whole family, and the poorest of all might not have one at all. Countries, rich and poor countries. Is there a gap? Is there a first world and a third world? Is there a developed and an undeveloped with a gap in the middle? No, there isn't. If you take a look at these figures, which are actually taken from Gapminder, each of those bubbles represents a country. So the size of the bubble represents the population. So the two big ones there, the two big red ones are China and India. The UK is up towards the top right-hand side, the wealthy side on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side we have the poorest countries. But you can see there's not a gap. There's nothing. There's a majority of countries are sitting somewhere in the middle. So if we're not going to talk about rich and poor, or first world and third world, or developed and undeveloped, we need a different way of looking at that. And here's a suggestion. So if we divide up people's income into 4 groups, level 1, 2, 3, and 4. Level 1 are the poorest people, they're on less than $2 a day. Level 2, between 2 and 8. Level 3, between $8 and $32 a day. And level 4, the wealthiest, and the UK on average falls into that category, at over $32 a day income. What does that actually look like for their lives? Well, at level 1, drinking water, you could be walking hours each day with a bucket to get water from a source that may not even be clean and hygienic. At level 2, maybe you can afford a bicycle to cut down your journey time. Level 3, there might be a tap somewhere in the village or wherever you live. And at level 4, you might have hot and cold running water in every home. If you look at transportation, those poor people are typically children in the poorest countries who are walking all those hours with buckets to get water, are walking barefoot. The bicycle I've mentioned at level 2, which makes a big difference. At level 3, you might be able to afford a moped or a motorcycle. And then you get to level 4 and we're talking about personal transport, cars, organised transport networks and the like. Eating, at level 1 you're probably eating the same meal every day of your life, and if the harvest fails you starve. Level 2, you can afford to buy in a bit of variety, you can afford to buy some food. Level 3, you can afford to eat more meat. And level 4, you've got a wide range of nutritious foods available to you. So different levels live different ways. And you can see on the chart, if I redisplay the gap chart of the countries, you can see there's no gap there, but if you look across the top, you can see the income levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the majority of people in the world are living in levels 2 and 3. We revisit Brazil. This is just an enlargement of the slide I showed you previously because it's not very clear. But again, you can see the majority of people in Brazil are living in level 2 and level 3, as opposed to being in the richest or the poorest groups. Men and women. You'd think there's a pretty fundamental gap there, wouldn't you? So let's take an example. We might say that men run faster than women. And if you take a look at my own age group, 60 to 69 age group, and you look at the average finishing times for males and females, you'll see there is a significant difference. The average male finishes in 4 hours 47, and the average female takes 5 hours 20. But if you look at a chart of female runners' finishing times, so over here we've got the fastest people of the lot finishing in just over 3 hours. And over on the right-hand side, we've got the stragglers, the people who are coming in at the slower end. But that vertical line, that vertical black line, is the average male finishing time. So the average male is beaten by almost a third of the women. There's no gap. And if you flip it on its head and look at the men's results, yeah, on average, you see that they do better. But that black line there is the average female finishing time. So the average female runner will finish faster than almost a third of the men. So averages are really, really handy things, but they're not enough on their own. You need to look at the spread. So the gap instinct, instinct is Hans Rosling's word for these things, rather than getting bogged down in cognitive biases and psychological jargon. My little checklist for that is Goa. So if you find yourself imagining two separate groups, ask yourself, are they actually two separate groups at all? If there are significant differences, is there overlap, like the male and female runners? And if there is a significant difference, the other group, the them, are they all alike? Rich and poor, are the poor people all alike, or are they different? So that's the gap instinct. So I'll run another little quiz here, just something for you to think about. How many of the world's 1-year children today do you think have been vaccinated against some disease? Is it 20%, 50%, or 80%? Another question. How many people in the world do you think have some access to electricity? 20%, 50%, or 80%? And the third question, where does the majority of the world population live? Is it in low-income countries, middle-income countries, or high-income countries? And the answers are, in each of the first two cases, 80%. 80% of 1-year-old children have had some sort of vaccination. 80% of the world have access to electricity. And you might have figured out from what I've been talking about recently, the majority of the world doesn't live in low-income countries or high-income countries. They live in somewhere in the middle. I wonder how you got on. So moving on, I've talked about the gap instinct. My second example from the Thankfulness book is the fear instinct. And this is the way that we naturally pay more attention to things that are dramatic and less to those that aren't. So if I show you a picture of this guy, your initial reaction, it might be to flinch a bit. If you saw one out swimming, you'd probably give it a wide berth. But actually, these ladies here kill more people each year than the sharks do. And of course, the media need drama. Here's a newspaper headline for you. Weather forecast correctly predicts mild weather. You think that's a real headline? Of course it isn't. What makes a good headline? It's true, but what makes a good headline? Earthquake, war, floods, refugees, terrorism, disease. This is the stuff that makes a good headline. So the media then will give added weight to reports of physical harm, violence by people, animals, sharp objects, knife crime, forces of nature, captivity, entrapment, loss of control, loss of freedom, and contamination, invisible substances that can infect or poison, radiation, coronavirus. So the media present it more. We naturally notice and remember it more. And so what's the result? We end up with an over-dramatic view of the world. And yet there's never been more factual data available to us. I'll give you two examples of the fear instinct. Here's number one. This was the Nepal earthquake in 2015. This was a horrible thing. 9,000 people died. 10 days of media coverage. But here's a quiz for you. How did the deaths per year from natural disasters change in the last century? Do you remember? It decreased to less than half. So we're better and better at dealing with these things. And you can see that here. If you look at the peak there on this chart around late 1930s, you can see there's been a pretty steady drop from 453 there down to just 10 people per million each year, deaths from disaster. So huge, huge improvement. But we don't necessarily hear about it or remember it. The world seems scarier than it is, because what you hear about it has been selected by your own attention filter or by the media precisely because it's scary. So my second example, who understands that fear instinct better even than the media do? Terrorists. Well, terrorism has increased. So if it has increased, then that's bad. We're right to be frightened. How is our fear instinct misleading us? This time. Have a think about this one. In 2016, for each 2,000 deaths worldwide, how many of those 2,000 do you think were due to terrorism? I'll give you the answer. 1. Or to put it another way, 1,999 were not. And what proportion of those deaths, those 1 in 2,000, occurred in level 4 countries like the UK? Well, this looks a pretty depressing chart actually. Each of those tombstones represents 1,000 people killed by terrorism over a 10-year period, which sounds dreadful until you compare it to the actual size of the population of the world. It's 1 in 2,000. And you can see here, these are level 1, level 2, level 3 countries, the number of people killed there. How many of these 1 in 2,000 people then were killed in level 4 countries like ours? Hardly any. And when we look at the UK, how do the number of terrorist-related deaths compare with other causes of death? So I went to the National Office of Statistics and the World Terrorism Database and GovUK and did a bit of ferreting around. Dementia and Alzheimer's killed nearly 70,000 people in 2018. Ischemic heart disease, another 55,000. But then I thought, okay, well, those, in a sense, those are natural deaths. What about injury, death from injury? Injury, poisoning, other external causes, 23,000. What about road traffic? Road deaths, 1,800. And for terrorism deaths, I took an average. I took it over a 20-year period and averaged it out because, of course, it varies from year to year. So how many terrorist-related deaths do you think we had on average per year in that period? 8. So the fear instinct then, the world seems scarier than it is, and we walk around being more scared than perhaps we need to be. But the information is out there. If we go looking for it, we can find the data. So get calm when something alarms you or concerns you and you feel you need to act. Get calm, get yourself cool before you make a decision. So, time to summarize. I introduced you to Hans Rosling here, and he told us deaths per year from natural disasters decreased to less than half in the last century. Women aged 30 in the world spent almost as many years in school as men. In the last 20 years, the percentage of people in the world living in extreme poverty has almost halved, and that's the percentage, that's not the number of people, that's the percentage, even with a growing population. And most people don't know this. I touched on Steven Pinker, and we talked about the fact that there's lots of other good news on all sorts of topics where you imagine it's nothing but doom and gloom. And we took a look at biases, mental shortcuts that we've evolved that help our brains come to quick decisions and snap decisions, but don't always give us the right answers. I listed off some examples of cognitive biases, heuristic biases as they're called. I gave you an example of selection bias, the way that we notice things more if we've got some reason to be interested in them or aware of them. And I pointed out that actually this isn't something that's restricted to stupid people or uneducated people. This is something that affects all of us, even the most intelligent and the most highly educated. We took a look at the gap instinct, levels 1, and I introduced the idea of levels 1 to 4. So rather than thinking of first world and third world, developed, undeveloped, maybe use these levels to compare different countries and different people within a country. And I talked about the difference in lifestyles between those people. Then we took a look at a gap that most people think men run faster than women. Yeah, there's a fundamental difference there, but we find actually there's a great deal of overlap. The average man may run faster than the average woman, but there's a lot of overlap. Then I moved on to the fear instinct. So I looked at the Nepal earthquake in 2015 and pointed out how much better we are at dealing with such events now, and how few people die from natural disasters compared to 100 years ago. We looked at terrorism and found that only 1 in 2,000 deaths worldwide was due to terrorism, and of those, hardly any took place in countries like our own. Conclusions? Maybe lighten up. Don't beat yourself up. Don't worry about it too much if you find yourself coming to a wrong conclusion occasionally. Look for them, obviously. Lighten up a little bit with others, because other people are subject to bias, but you yourself are as well. And feel able to say, actually, I don't have an opinion on that because I don't know enough about it. If you want an opinion, let it be an informed opinion by the facts. So who has the facts? Whatever source you're looking at, whether it be a newspaper or a TV channel or social media, take a look at it and ask yourself some questions. Is it presenting both sides? Is it looking for shades of grey, or is it just black and white? How does it make you feel? Is it pushing your buttons? Is it frightening you, concerning you, making you imagine that some group or institution is dangerous? Does it have an axe to grind? If it's a newspaper, who owns it? Do the owners have particular political views, for example? Or are they a campaigning organisation with a single issue campaigning organisation? Is it including its sources? Is it telling you when it makes a claim, is it telling you where that claim is coming from? That's usually a good sign. If you can go and look up the original source and check it out for yourself, then whoever's presenting you with the news is probably doing a good job. And statistics. You can prove anything with statistics. Does the statistic contradict current views? Be a little bit wary, maybe. Is it relevant to you? I went to a talk about a year ago by a lady who did research into sex, and she mentioned all sorts of statistics and results of research. And in the Q&A at the end, a lady of retiring age said, well, do all these things that you've discovered and these statistical results, do they apply to retired people, older people? And the lady said, well, we don't know. because when we do research into statistics, we do it in universities and we do it with students because they're cheap. Is it relevant to me? Is it a non-story? Does it answer the key questions? 50,000 people do so-and-so each year. 50,000 out of how many? 30% more people get this disease if they do this. Yeah, okay. So how many people get it anyway? Is it 1 in a million, 3 in a million, or is it 1 in 10? How much difference would it actually make? And I hope to do a talk at some time in the future that looks at that and demystifies some of these stats and gives you a few simple questions to ask that will help you sort the wheat from the chaff. Okay, what effect then? We've got these biases, these mental shortcuts that give us the wrong answer. What effect might these biases have? Well, of course, you might find the fatalists. Aid for the poor, yeah, none of it's working. Why throw good money after bad? But in fact, we've seen in this talk, actually, poverty in world poverty is decreasing. We're doing something right. The environment, oh no, it's all going down the tubes. Nothing's going to work. Eat, drink, and be merry. Tomorrow we die. But we've seen there's good news on the environment as well. And then there's the radicals. Oh, the system's failed, the aid system, the political system, the police, it's failed. Smash the machine, drain the swamp. What follows must be better. Has the system failed? Is it really black and white? Or are there shades of grey? Is it maybe working better than you think? So the subtitle of the book, the Thankfulness book that I base this on, is called 10 Reasons We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. So if you have questions, we can't do obviously because this is a recording, but if you have any feedback for me on the talk, things that you liked, suggestions, maybe things I could do better, other audiences, that would be great. If you can suggest somebody else who might be interested in hearing the talk. I have another talk called Evolution and Natural Selection, if anybody's interested in hearing that. And I hope to do two. I mentioned this one. I want to do a talk looking at statistics and asking a few simple questions to help you make sense out of the statistics that you find and sort out the rubbish from the good stuff. And I'd also like to take a look at making sense of science. Because science to me, in its details, is complicated. But broadly speaking, it's really just common sense. So this is my website. You can look up, I'm going to suggest some references and stuff in a moment that you might be interested, videos to watch and so on. But if you want to look them up afterwards, they're all listed on this website. This is the book that inspired the talk, Thankfulness, by Rosling and his son and daughter-in-law. And Gapminder is the website that they set up. This is a really interesting website where, regardless of whether you're interested in graphs and figures or interested in photos and people's lives, they have a wonderful thing called Dollar Street, where they imagine the world's population living in a single street, and they have thousands of photographs of people living at different levels and showing what their lives are like. On YouTube, these are my 3 favorite short videos by Rosling. You might want to take a look at some of those. The one I took the clip from is half an hour long, and that's called How Not to Be Ignorant About the World. And I mentioned Steven Pinker. His book, Enlightenment Now, is huge. I think it's about 400 or 600 pages. His talk is an hour long, and there are a lot of slides in it. If you want a slightly more condensed version, he does another talk called Is the World Getting Better or Worse? That's about half an hour. And since you've been listening to this talk, you can probably guess, spoiler alert, it's getting better. And that's my talk. Thank you for listening.